Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Aussie Aliens and Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon series. In part 2 of Frederick Valentich's Disappearance and UFO sighting, we take a look at the other UFO sightings in the area when he disappeared. There were so many, they needed their own episode. Now in this video, we're concentrating more on what was sighted on the evening and prior to the disappearance. And there were a couple of sightings afterwards, I believe, as well, but we'll concentrate primarily on what was seen around the time of the disappearance and what could it all mean. Now, just a recap of what part 1 was about. There was a young 20-year-old man from Melbourne named Frederick Valentich, and he dreamed of being a pilot, initially in the RAAF, and then, when that failed for him, to become a commercial pilot. However, he was failing his examinations, and hope kind of seemed a bit lost on him. But he did have a wonderful girlfriend who he was close to, a loving family who he was also close to. He was part of the cadets, as well as he was being mentored by one of the squadron instructors. So, at this point, he had failed most of his exams for 1978 and hadn't bothered to take the remaining. Then a strange thing happened on the 21st of October of 1978. Frederick Valentich goes missing on a flight that he'd taken before, though he hadn't done in the evening. The plane had had problems, but those problems were supposed to have been fixed. Another strange thing we've encountered was that Rhonda, his partner, was meant to go out with him that day or night, but he'd forgotten about it. They were going to meet up afterwards, or her story also stated they were going to go together. So there's a couple of discrepancies about what Rhonda says as well. Also, the reason for his flight. Family and friends have known him to go and get crayfish on this flight. He told the people he rented the plane off that he was going there to pick up passengers, as they didn't like crayfish in their planes. He'd not organised any landing lights as it was getting dark at King Island Airport. If he intended to land, wouldn't he have organised landing lights so he could see where he was going? Even though it was still a little light, as he was not a professional pilot and had only done this flight a couple of times, never at night, you'd think he would have taken all precautions. As well as, when interviewed, the man that he bought the crayfish from hadn't had an order put in from him in order to have anything ready for him to pick up. The strangeness still continues. Why was he in the air? If he wasn't to pick up crayfish and he wasn't to pick up people, as there were none waiting at King Island on the night, then why was he in the air? He'd failed his tests. He wasn't taking any more tests that year that we know of. Was he just getting flying hours? Or was he simply just wanting to be in the air? Or was there something more to it? We'll never really know unless something is found, and so far no substantial evidence has been found, not relating directly to his Cessna 182L. So then there's the other explanation, his radio conversation before silence. Frederick Valentich stated, as in part 1, if you haven't seen it already, go and watch it, that he sighted a UFO before never being heard from again. So it's very confusing, and hence why it's a massive story. I mean, where did Frederick Valentich go? Did he die? Is he still out there somewhere? Was he abducted by extra terrestrials or other beings? What happened to this guy? Well, what we're going to do in this episode is talk about some of the sightings that were reported around the time of this disappearance, as well as some reported sometime later. This information has been gathered by Keith Basterfield and a couple of other researchers that we named in part 1. Now, the first sighting that we have down is from the 18th of October, 3 days before Frederick disappears. Now, Frederick is known to be curious about the UFOs. He hasn't actually come out and said aliens or extraterrestrials, but UFOs. He'd seen one with his mother, which we'd mentioned in part 1, as well as on a camping trip with the Air Corps that he was with. It's interesting to note that his father Guido, who never came out and said that he'd seen anything particularly, but always stated, until his death sadly, that he believed that his son had been abducted. He also said, and must have had conversations with Frederick before the disappearance, that Frederick was worried about an attack by UFOs on Earth. So it's very strange. He obviously had conversations with his father about UFOs. It was in a time, let's remember, this is the late 70s. It isn't now when people are so much more open-minded. You were laughed at. I mean, Whitley Strieber had not even come out with communion at this stage. Very few people even spoke about this stuff, but there were still sightings. There have been many sightings for thousands of years in indigenous rock carvings, as well as paintings, even some depicting Jesus. So people have been seeing things for a long time now, but only until recently, the last couple of decades, have we even acknowledged that it's a possibility. So let's begin the sightings leading up to Frederick Valentich's disappearance. 18th of October, 3 days before Frederick Valentich disappears. At 7 p.m, Geoffrey Hoare from South Blackburn, east of Melbourne, watched a circular light with a disc-shaped body. It brightened and dimmed as it was going along, then faded out completely. It was 10 to 15 degrees elevation to the south. Now, after these reports, the RAAF wrote it off as being Venus, the planet, despite at this time Venus set west, not south, and was 20 degrees elevation, not 10 to 15. So that's not a lot of difference. But Venus isn't disc-like, and it doesn't seem to fade in and out. Venus is quite a bright planet when you can see it above the horizon. On the 20th of October, the day before Frederick's disappearance, at 2:45 p.m. in Alexandra, which is 132 kilometres northeast of Melbourne, a Mrs. Cassic watched an object with no sound pass over Mount Buller, east of Alexandra, moving toward Healesville, south-southwest of Alexandra, in an arc. Mrs. Cassic described the object as looking like a zeppelin or massive trout, so kind of like a blimp. This is a very similar description as to what was given by Frederick Birmingham in our first Aussie Aliens video from the 1860s. He said too that it looked like some kind of a fish. Now, after reported, the RAAF believed it to be simply an aircraft of theirs moving slowly. It's quite interesting that they would just say it was an aircraft when clearly she's said it's a zeppelin or fish-shaped thing. Also on the 20th, making note that it's highly unlikely that Frederick Valentich would have known about any of these sightings. Now at 3 p.m, on board an aircraft flying over Bast Strait, for 20 minutes, a lady by the name of Patricia stated they departed Tullamarine Airport on a plane bound for Devonport in Tasmania at 2:45. So somewhere around that 3 p.m, they flew over Bast Strait. Seated at the back left of the plane, she noticed an oval-shaped object below the plane, but above the clouds. She described it as having circles of rainbow colours on its exterior, with a red light in its centre. She said it was easily viewed against the white clouds. It remained with the plane at the same speed following. Patricia was distracted only for a moment by the stewardess, and when looked back, the object was gone. Now this is a strange one. Investigators into this particular one stated that this was a meteorological optical phenomenon called glory, which is basically the reflection of the plane against the clouds. Due to the position of the plane, the sun, and the position of Patricia, she saw this optical illusion. Look it up, it's quite interesting. Now at 8:25 p.m, in Port Melbourne, southwest of Melbourne, for 9 minutes, H and K Cameron witnessed something with a flashing light under it at a 45-degree elevation, coming from the bay, south, going towards the city, north. Now the RAAF stated it was a satellite, a particular satellite that they've called US OAO A2 1968. So they've boldly stated they knew exactly which satellite that H and K Cameron witnessed. Now, a lot of people don't usually give their full names. I mean, if they're going to get ridiculed and laughed at and made fun of, they probably won't give their full name. So, but then in other circumstances, we've got a full name. So it probably depends on the person. I mean, I can understand that the RAAF must have checked where Venus and this satellite were in regard to the people and the timing and the sky on what day or whatever. Now, unless you're someone that avidly watches the skies, it seems to me that these people are just kind of glimpsing something. It's not like they're fanatics that are constantly looking for something to report. To me, it sounds like people have sighted something and they've reported it, because it was something that their minds couldn't work out what it was. It was obviously important enough because it drove them to report it. And sometimes you just get that kind of inkling. I mean, often you look at the sky and you see, a balloon floating past that's been let go by some child, or an aeroplane, or a helicopter. But sometimes you look at the sky and you think, what is that? And your mind really can't answer it. So in these cases, obviously the feeling was strong enough in these people who have sighted these to report it. This was also in a time that we've got Star Wars coming out and things like that. There's movies about space. So many sightings in close proximity to Melbourne, though, seems very coincidental. Another sighting at 10:45 p.m. on the same night, the 20th of October, in Cheshunt, 295 kilometres northeast of Melbourne, a Carol Gibbs views on a clear night sheets of red and green coloured lights and white lights in a circling motion with no sound. Now the RAAF, after investigating into this claim, stated it was the star Sirius that she was seeing. However, I've seen Sirius in the sky and I can't describe it as being sheets of green and red light. It doesn't, was she smoking something? Like, you don't see those kind of colours when you look at a star. Sure, like a little tinge here and there, but sheets of red and green? It kind of, to me, sounded a little bit like the Aurora Borealis. Those kind of lights in the sky are a massive phenomenon. This isn't just a star. If this woman's really seen this, come on, a star? Yet another sighting at the same time, 10:45, this time in Warburton, 72 kilometres east of Melbourne, Peter Campbell viewed a square box-like object with white lights, no noise, no tail, very slowly travelling from northeast to west. Now, the RAAF and investigators did not comment or investigate this particular claim based on so few details. Few details? I don't know, that sounded pretty detailed to me. Anyway, we move along. Now, if that wasn't enough action for you, we get to the day of Frederick's disappearance, 21st of October. Now at midday, a young woman from Latrobe, northwestern Tasmania, whilst hanging out clothes on her Hills hoist, noticed a round, almost football-shaped, silvery, shiny object high in the sky, going southwest to north toward the Bast Strait. She pointed it out to two other children, aged 10 and 15. No sound or vapour trail, while it travelled overhead. After losing sight of it, she went back to hanging clothes out. Investigations through TUFOIC, or the Tasmanian UFO Investigation Centre, received this information 10 days later and believed it was simply an aeroplane. But, I think most people know what an aeroplane looks like. I mean, we've seen a bunch of them, and in the 70s it wouldn't be any different. And we know what one sounds like going overhead. If there's one that's so far high up in the sky, I mean, the mind automatically goes, oh yeah, it's an aeroplane. But a football shape, I don't know. I don't believe that these people were seeing planes. But anyway, at 1 p.m, back in Victoria, at Tullamarine, northwest of Melbourne, a Robert Bratich was heading toward the city in a taxi. Hovering over a Westfield shopping centre at 45-degree elevation was a shiny metallic covered oval shape with no sound. The RAAF commented that it was most likely a balloon from the shopping centre promotions, how sometimes they have a bunch of balloons on the roof. Yet it's not noted if they actually followed up with calling the Westfield shopping centre and confirming that balloons were in fact on their roof. At 2 p.m. in Curry, King Island, for 10 minutes, a woman sunbathing in her backyard against a clear sky noted a singular cloud. From this cloud emerged a sphere, golf ball-like, about a quarter of the size of the moon, which on this particular day evening was 3/4 full. White or silver in colour, moving very slowly toward the sea, then at an angle of approximately 70 degrees, stopped and started moving back where it had come from. Now this I find very intriguing, given what was to happen later that afternoon. Investigations were not made. However, a theory was that it was a meteorological balloon, although VUFOS, the Victorian UFO Research Society website, states that there were no launches from King Island that weekend. I don't know about you, but when I hear the term weather balloon, it makes me very suspicious, knowing what we know about the reality of Roswell. Now at 3 p.m, in Corio, near Geelong, 75 kilometres southwest of Melbourne, twin cigar-shaped objects moving slowly from west to east were viewed by 12 people on a tennis court, as well as a number of cricket players on a field. Sighted at 75 degrees elevation, being silver in colour, connected by two silver pipes, moving with no sound or means of propulsion. No wings. Estimated to be slightly smaller than jumbo jets. Over Victoria near to Bast Strait. It was last seen around 4:30 as per witness Mark Laney at the Corio tennis court. He stated suddenly they changed colour from silver to white, then made a sweeping curve to the north and sped away. He states as he was under the object, it was 3/4 the size of a Boeing 747 together. Last sighted over Cape Otway. Never investigated. And the VUFORS, or Victorian UFO Research Centre, has never offered any explanation as to what it could be. Now at 4:15, a Mrs. G and her 14-year-old son were heading from Geelong to Cape Otway to a holiday home when they caught sight of twin cigar-shaped objects also. They got out of the car to get a better view. So obviously, if they've stopped the car to get out, they've seen something. It's not just an aeroplane. We don't stop a car and get out for an aeroplane. Mrs. G noted one object was slightly behind the other. They stayed in close formation before then also confirming they changed colour from silver to white, and with a sweeping curve north, sped away with no sound. How interesting is that? At the same time, someone in a car is viewing these twin cigar-shaped objects as 12 people on a tennis court and several others in a cricket ground. So that's really, how can you ignore that? Everyone's seen the same damn thing. Cigar-shaped with pipes connecting it. No other wings or anything like that. It's just kind of in the air, moving slowly. And then it sweeps north and speeds off. Do we have any aircraft that can do this? Maybe. But we're not supposed to know about them, are we? Well, although recorded in Muon Journal, the Mutual UFO Network, the Muon Journal, November 1979, no explanation was ever offered and no investigations had taken place about it. I'm beginning to wonder why the Air Force are not investigating them. Could it be human, military, experimental aircraft? Or using extraterrestrial aircraft or intelligence? And this seems to be what they're calling the Westall UFO these days. The Westall UFO was sighted by about 300 people, including students and teachers, in 1966. There were a sighting of a UFO touching down on a field and lifting off into the air right in front of high school kids. We'll definitely do this story in a later episode. Westall High School was in Clayton in Victoria, which isn't that far from where these other sightings were, including where Frederick Valentich lived. But many people are starting to suspect that that particular sighting was humans in experimental aircraft. Now, if they were doing that in 1966, what could they have been doing in 1978? And what the hell are they doing now? We know it was happening in the US in the 1980s, with Bob Lazar being hired to reverse engineer the extraterrestrial aircraft. But could they have been testing it also down under? Following the timeline from the World War II, where we get the term Foo Fighters, described by Allied aircraft as unidentified flying objects that they viewed in the sky during World War II. Herr Klein, a German engineer, stated that they were flying UFOs in the war. He was present when one was launched in Prague in 1945. Now, whether this was true or if he was put up to it to try and dismiss these claims, this notification didn't come out till 1954, after Roswell. So this could have been something to hush everybody up too, stating that the enemy craft was using these silver disc UFOs. Since then, we've had barges in Australian waters claiming that they've seen UFOs coming overhead while they've been out at sea. As well as in the US, 1960s, several missiles were either shot out of the sky by UFOs or disabled by them. Quite interesting indeed. Well, they obviously don't want us to blow ourselves up.
Robert Salas served 7 years in the Air Force, rising to the rank of captain.
March 24th, 1967, I and my commander, Fred Mywall, were on duty at Roy, Montana. We had control of 10 nuclear missiles. Sometime in the early morning, it means if we were given the order and if we had to go through our launch procedures, they couldn't be launched.
Could these lights have been some Soviet aircraft or drone?
Absolutely not. All aircraft that I know of make some sort of a sound and have some sort of a propulsion system that we can explain. Nothing like that. And by the way, I worked for Federal Aviation Administration in aircraft structures for 22 some years. So I think I know my aircraft.
Australia had many sightings in the 50s and then 60s. So, of course, in the 70s, there would be sightings too. I think there's sightings all the time, which absolutely makes for great stories. The government and skeptics have always been ready with various answers to what everything that anyone has cited usually is, and when they haven't been able to come up with an excuse or something substantial, then they wouldn't investigate them at all. Sun halos, sun dogs, and sun pillars have often been used to describe what most have thought were UFOs back in the day. But what about this 1950s article from Canberra, where plans for an alien aircraft to be created were found on someone's desk inside Parliament? Oops. Another sighting around 11 p.m. after Frederick had gone missing. A man contacts the Department of Transport investigators on the 23rd of October to inform that his 11-year-old son had seen a long streak of greenish-white light flash across the sky south of the Barwon Heads area, about 120 kilometres from Cape Otway. Even a Mr. P. Farr of Burwood, he was also an officer in the RAAF Reserve, contacted investigators himself to state that he'd witnessed a shower of very bright metallic scintillations to the south, high in the sky about 30 bright centres. Again on the same night, a man by the name of Wayne Bellow witnessed a U.A.P while camping with his wife at Bateman's Bay in New South Wales. He described it as being bright white object performing wild stunts over the ocean. He said it was performing such incredible manoeuvres that any conventional pilot who tried it would have been guts over kneecaps, he says. Now, the sightings didn't stop there. 6 weeks after Valentich went missing, an amateur photographer who was capturing the sunset off Cape Otway found something unexpected in his developed photos. It was something in the sky against the sunset. At first he thought it was just some dirt or something that may have come up on the negative and then had been processed, but after taking it back to Kodak, they stated that there was no dirt on the negatives. American photo analysts determined that it was a metallic object in the sky, in what was apparently a cloud of exhaust. It would have been about a mile from the camera, they stated. Could that have been Frederick Valentich at the time he was coming across? Or was it possibly something happening to him? Or was it simply a UFO? No one knows for sure. Another sighting by a man who came forward around the time stated he'd seen Frederick Valentich, or at least a Cessna, heading toward Cape. There was a lot of backwards and forwards between Frederick's father Guido and the Department of Transport to try and get information released to them. They were certain he did not end his own life. Divers claimed to have had photos which they were going to charge $10,000 to Guido, but wouldn't let him have the photos first to confirm it was the correct Cessna unless he paid the $10,000. Another man, Ron Cameron, stated he wanted to make a movie about it and have this particular plane raised out of the water. He paid the money but could not be sure it was the right Cessna and couldn't get the backing to have it all go ahead. A filmmaker in 1981 by the name of Brian Morris intended to make an expensive documentary about Fred's disappearance. He was going to import the same type of Cessna from the United States and tow it across Bast Strait and ditch it in the sea. This would be done to see what happened to the wreckage if it had crashed in Bast Strait. A New Zealand clairvoyant and author, Colin Amory, held a seance in his Dunedin home on Saturday night exactly 6 months after Valentich disappeared. He said to Guido to be in Frederick's room at the time of the seance. However, due to the time difference, he was in the room 2 hours early. But during a conversation through Mr. Amory, Valentich is said to have told the seance that 60 seconds of the radio transcript was suppressed and edited out. The allegation is in line with the highly publicised claims from friends and family after its release. Amory states that Valentich is supposed to have said that he is safe but no longer has a physical body, that he is now in the light and can move to wherever he needs to be. Amory states that Valentich told him at the seance that his skills were needed elsewhere and that they've come down to take him. This was relayed to Guido, but he was very sceptical about these claims and stated that it may have been an attempt for Amory to publicise his newly released book, New Atlantis. Amory was also a big believer in the Tasman Triangle or Bast Strait Triangle that has been compared to the Bermuda Triangle. It is believed that many ships and aircraft have been lost venturing through that Bast Strait area over the last 200 years. We may have to look into this particular claim. In 1998, a researcher from Vufoz, Paul Norman, interviewed an anonymous man who claimed to be a witness on the night that Frederick disappeared. He said it took place on the Great Ocean Road at Barham River, about a kilometre south of Apollo Bay. He said that just beyond the bridge there, he pulled over his car where he and his 2 nieces, looking in an easterly direction toward the sea, observed a Cessna aeroplane slowly descending in a diagonal direction, with light fading as it was dusk. He could clearly make out the Cessna and its distinctive white navigation lights and red wingtip light. But more astonishingly, he states the Cessna was being pursued by a much larger craft, illuminated by a green circular light travelling on top of and slightly to the rear of the Cessna. He and his nieces stood watching this event for half a minute until both aircraft disappeared from view to the northeast. It was clear that if the Cessna had continued on its diagonal downward trajectory, it would have splashed down in the sea just off the coast near Apollo Bay. The researchers Paul Norman and Richard Haynes then wrote a paper about this sighting, in which they suggested that based on the witness description, it was highly probable that Fred had changed course when he encountered the U.A.P. This coinciding with what many of his friends believed might have happened. However, as stated in our previous video, their searches all came up with nothing. Something happened that night to Frederick Valentich and his Cessna. What it was, we'll maybe never know, but it's an incredible story and true. It's something we definitely had to report on. We hope you enjoyed this episode, or both episodes. If you did, make sure to like both of them and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you're aware when we're putting up more UFO videos.